It's 1954, and the South Australian Housing Trust is busy constructing a new town on the 3,000 plus acres of farmland they had begun purchasing just a few years before. In the mid-20th century, post-World War II, Australia was suffering from shortages in population and industry. Every state was doing its bit to rebuild the country, and the new town under construction was the South Australian government's jewel in its crown. On the 16th of November 1955, the new town was officially unveiled to the world and named Elizabeth, after Queen Elizabeth II, by then Premier Thomas Playford. The following day, the first residents started to arrive. Most have emigrated from the UK following the Australian government's Populate or Perish campaign, and thousands more would follow as part of the £10 POMS movement. The Housing Trust, meanwhile, have envisioned a town where the interests of the community and industry can co-inhabit with mutual benefit, and those who come to populate the new town, residents, landowners, and industrialists, will be expected to conform. Residents and workers will be outfitted with well-planned residential areas, fitted with their own local shopping centres, kindergarten and schools. There will be plenty of opportunities for community participation, with recreational reserves, parks, churches, and local sporting clubs. While the industrialists will benefit from well-designed and designated industrial areas, a ready-made workforce, and the careful selection of firms. And it was these well-designed and designated industrial areas with their ready-made workforce and the careful selection of firms that the South Australian Housing Trust hoped would isolate Elizabeth from future economic downturns. By 1960, Elizabeth had gone from a population of just 78 families in November 1955 to a population of over 15,000. It was a growth surpassing both the Trust and Thomas Playford's expectations. With that rapid growth, the Trust had to keep thinking on its feet, constantly reinventing and reimagining the type of town Elizabeth was to be. The years between 1955 and 1960 had seen the Housing Trust working tirelessly to promote community connection and belonging, while the 1960s would see a shift toward making the new town economically viable. And having laid the foundations for community life and participation in the first 5 years of Elizabeth's existence, the Trust now began to focus more seriously on its economic prospects. For the Trust, Elizabeth was a fresh start, a place for the future without a past, a place lacking history. For the Trust, they were making history. A utopian vision where industry and community harmonized to create a city of tomorrow. But what the planners failed to consider was that as the town grew, each new occupant that came to populate the area brought with them their own history. And in the end, it was those histories, along with shifting economies and a winding down on immigration itself, which would have the greater influence on Elizabeth and its future. In the end, the Elizabeth Thomas Playford and the South Australian Housing Trust had hoped for would fail to materialise, but neither would the tomorrow hoped for by Elizabeth's original residents, landowners and employers. In the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the Housing Trust would drive visiting luminaries through the town as a shining example of superior town planning and future development, what by the 1960s they were calling the City of Tomorrow. They would even be invited to conferences around the country to show off the new town and advise on future developments in other states, but by the 1980s, it would be welfare groups and social workers who would come here for tours of inspection. Inside just one generation, the model community originally envisioned became a lesson in social breakdown and the inherent failures in utopian visions. Produced in 1961 by the South Australian Housing Trust, A Place to Grow was meant as a calling card for prospective new residents, aimed primarily at attracting suitable white English stock. This film gives us a good idea about the kind of people the Trust wished to populate the new town and what was expected from them once they did. The film tells a story of happy families living in self-contained suburbs with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbours, quality schools and modern housing. There are quality industrial areas too, with jobs just waiting like low-hanging fruit for the menfolk, followed by a drink with the boys down at the local. For the women, meaning wives and mothers, there were the local shopping centres provided in each individual suburb to do the shopping after dropping off the children at one of the local schools, located within easy walking distance of the shops, while most people seem to be talking with an odd, middle-class English accent.
My word, I like the way you furnished this room.
Yes, we're very comfortable now. Had a bit of fun and games, getting things straight, of course.
Fun, was it?
Here and there.
Keep in mind, the original plans for Elizabeth were drawn up in the early 50s, a time when traditional roles for men and women were very different. It was expected that the husband would provide the financial support to the family and drive a car, while wives took on the burden of providing the emotional heart of the household and community and walked everywhere. This is why in those early designs, any domestic concerns like shops and schools were within easy walking distance for the mothers, while industrial areas were further away and required a car for easy access. By 1960, however, cultural norms were changing rapidly, largely through modern inventions and civil rights movements. No longer did either men or women have to remain so constrained in their traditional roles. By the 70s and 80s, it was common for women to drive and provide financial support, no longer necessitating the need for local shops within walking distance. And within a generation, these local facilities would decline into neglect and disrepair as more and more they were ignored for the more sophisticated shopping outlets in the town centre. Watching A Place to Grow, it appears the film producers were oblivious to the changes taking place around them and on the world stage, or perhaps were trying desperately to ignore them. Expectations about gender were essential to the Trust's original vision of community life, and A Place to Grow is more evidence that the Trust's original vision for Elizabeth, however well-intentioned, was dead on arrival. For that part of its vision was based on a social structure that was rapidly falling into the history books, and could have no future in a city that truly was of tomorrow. The film also suggests that the Trust was a little confused about who the town was built for. They appeared to be attempting to attract well-spoken, middle-class English families into a working-class factory town. The type of resident the Trust wanted to attract to Elizabeth either didn't exist, or if they did, probably wouldn't be interested in a town like Elizabeth anyway, and certainly not in the numbers that would be needed to make it a success either socially or economically. The Elizabethan depicted in A Place to Grow existed only in the Trust's imagination, and would have no relevance or influence to life on the ground. With a clear vision of their ideal occupants for their new town, Thomas Playford and the Housing Trust went about designing the ideal geography for Elizabeth, relying upon assumptions about the appropriate role of different social groups. They went about designing a landscape where everyone had their place and their function. Few objectives were more important to the Trust than the vitalization of community life. From the outset, they did all they could to promote belonging, providing land for meeting halls and sports grounds, giving advice and encouragement to local groups, and putting a bit of pressure on churches and voluntary organisations to move quickly into Elizabeth. Yet assumptions about community, which dominated the thinking of Elizabeth's town planners, demanded more than a few physical and organisational structures. Community relied on the presence of natural leaders. Invariably, these leadership skills were equated with superior social status, so the Housing Trust had to build into Elizabeth the goods which would attract them: superior housing, better class residential areas, and the civic and cultural arenas where they could come together and lay the foundations of community life. A key objective in Elizabeth's physical design was in what the Trust referred to as balanced, happy social groups, with self-containment being a key strategy. A commitment to provide Elizabeth with enough jobs, cultural and educational facilities to ensure that residents would not have to travel far to meet most of their needs, Individual suburbs were also to be self-contained in terms of local shopping and primary schools. The point was to make Elizabeth relatively self-sufficient in jobs and urban services. Anchoring Elizabeth's people in place would remove distractions to civic life, as community jobs close to home meant that men could return quickly to the family. For women, self-containment meant shopping, schools, and most facilities close at hand and within walking distance, as well as family homes at a safe distance from industrial and commercial areas. A precise meaning as to what was meant by social balance in Elizabeth was always hard to come by, however. Social balance sometimes meant a balance between social groups within the town, so that Elizabeth as a whole would contain a representative sample of the Australian class structure, even if different groups lived in different classes of suburbs. While at other times it appeared to mean balancing the population of each individual suburb itself, so that each would become a microcosm of the wider society. At that level, ideas of social balancing often blended into ideas of social mix. The idea that within each balanced suburb, residents of various social classes would rub shoulders in integrating institutions, schools, churches, sports, and community centres. As a complement to the Trust's physical design of Elizabeth and its neighbouring suburbs, expectations around gender were also central to this idea of balanced, happy social groups. While the men were out working, their unemployed and gregarious wives would devote their spare time to community creation. Inside and outside the ideal home, Elizabeth women were to fulfill precise roles as wives, mothers, and neighbours. Single women in particular had no place in this version of Elizabeth, and would most likely find themselves siphoned off to the Trust's nearby public housing estate, its so-called poor relation at Salisbury North. The Trust and its planners had expectations that community in Elizabeth depended on a definite physical form, and that only a balance of people from different social classes would guarantee the development of communal relationships, with those relationships being led and directed by the natural leaders of community, the middle class. Despite claims that middle-class people would also benefit from an interaction with those beneath them, the working class, it is generally clear whose behaviour and whose culture was considered deficient. Social mix relies on the leavening effects of middle-class and working-class proximity, and proximity was believed to mean emulation. Elizabeth promised not so much just a major redistribution of opportunity for the working-class immigrants who had come to occupy the town, but a general raising of their standards. Working-class people were to be harmonised with and reconciled to the middle classes by becoming a reduced copy of them. Elizabeth's planners understood that a socially balanced city meant a city of distinct spaces for different kinds of people. From the beginning, this was to be a balanced and stratified community, so that social mix would go hand in hand with social distinction. To this end, Elizabeth would need a definite hierarchy of housing types and locations. The site happily provided one opportunity, with a flat plain for rental housing and enough high ground to provide a better class residential area as the town developed. Elizabeth could then replicate Adelaide's intricate link between elevation, however slight, and social status, and for all their superficial similarities and monotonous appearance, Elizabeth's suburbs would differ in one important respect: the proportion of rental housing. This would depend on how close your suburb was to the industrial areas and how far it was from the middle-class hill slopes. In Elizabeth's first suburbs, at all times, the main thoroughfares were lined with single homes often for sale, so that the vista presented to the passing motorist was that of normal suburban homes, not public housing. In the first Elizabeth neighbourhoods, the proportion of rental houses, mostly semi-detached, ranged from 68% in Elizabeth South and 59% in Elizabeth North, farthest from the hill slopes and closest to the industrial areas, to 44% in the upwardly inclining Elizabeth East, and 39% in Elizabeth Vale, with its southerly exposure to parks and the Little Para River. Elizabeth Downs to the east ended with less than a third of its housing for rent, while extensions up the hill face were almost entirely detached houses for sale, as was Hillbank, Elizabeth's tiny Nob Hill. As the 50s came to a close, Elizabeth's economic future, and as a result South Australia's, was looking good. With the recent acquisition of land by General Motors Holden and a flurry of other notable interstate and international industrialists moving into the new town, it was soon deemed imperative that expansion was needed to develop a new industrial area, as well as the housing estates required to house the influx of new workers. Bordered by Salisbury to the south and Manapara to the north and east, west was the logical place to go. To connect the town centre more directly to the west, Winterslow Bridge was commissioned, opening in 1960 by Thomas Playford. Initially intended as an expansion of Elizabeth itself, at that time Elizabeth still came under the council district of Salisbury, and in the end, rather than expand Salisbury, Elizabeth West, Field and Smithfield Plains would all end up under the council district of Manapara. Prior to the expansion west, Elizabeth had, more or less, developed at a pace planned for by the Trust, and the physical design of those earlier suburbs reflect a confidence and attention to detail to match. Now things begin to get ahead of the Trust in terms of planning these additional suburbs at the social level, and the thoughtful attention to the ratio between rental housing and home ownership made way for an urgent need to provide cheap rental housing for the expected influx of new migrant workers. These later additions of Elizabeth West, Field and Smithfield Plains, close to the western industrial area and furthest away from any hill slopes, would be dominated by double-unit rental houses. In Smithfield Plains, a whopping 74% of the housing stock was of this type. When the economic downturn of the 1970s began making itself felt, and more of Elizabeth's industrialists either folded, downsized, or simply relocated for cheaper labour costs, it is perhaps these later suburbs that suffered the most, with the highest proportion of residents dependent on factory work that was no longer there. In the end, the Trust would sabotage its own idea about socially balanced neighbourhood suburbs, falling back on a more or less balanced city as good enough. As the economic downturn of the 70s took its toll, there were less and less signs of middle-class activity in Elizabeth, as most moved away to the more affluent areas their status could afford them. How social mix was supposed to work as a complement to the Trust's physical design of the town was never made clear. Despite the guarantee of their expert designs, Elizabeth's planners would be continuously surprised by the way inhabitants of their landscape could change it. This is precisely what those designs could never countenance, that residents, and in particular working-class residents, were spatially and socially creative, that they would use planned space in their own ways. Elizabeth's early history would not be defined by its planners' victory over disorder, but by the re-emergence of collisions and conflicts as people made sense and made use of their space. Homeowners tried to secure their advantages against renters and dominate local decision-making. The town's youth occupied and vandalized public areas. Residents set up small businesses in their backyards. Working women commuted to Adelaide. Local workers disputed with factory managers. Landowners looked for loopholes and encumbrances, while shoppers skipped the local stores for the flashier shops in the town centre. Elizabeth's plans stressed the physical boundaries, not the more tenuous, less easily manipulated contents encircled by those boundaries. These boundaries were based, at least in the beginning, on class, with carefully delineated divisions between types of housing and the types of residents expected to inhabit them. They were also based on gender, at a time when the majority of women still stayed home and travelled on foot, while their husbands drove and worked, expecting men to cross the neighbourhood boundary to work, while women inhabited the manless daytime streets, perhaps emerging once in a while for a trip to the town centre. Through expert design with its self-contained suburbs and self-contained industrial areas, a well-laid-out town centre with its gardens and wide roads which divided its surrounding suburbs into pockets for domestic retreats, the Trust and its planners tried to make Elizabeth a well-serviced and socially balanced community. Providing leaders with middle-class skills and interests in a working-class town, however, proved rather difficult in the end, especially because the first imperative of many middle-class newcomers was to establish their distance and distinction from renters and factory workers. Lacking sufficient evidence of middle-class leadership activity at the neighbourhood level, ideas about the type of town Elizabeth was to be were already changing by as early as 1960. And as the 1950s came to a close, Elizabeth was becoming a city for industry and a key player in South Australia's economic future. And so, the Trust instead turned to another measure of community success: economic growth, and the Trust's poorly defined social objectives became overshadowed by another version of the town: a place of perpetual profit.